All right, thank you so much, Chris, for your help with all of our programming this week. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Games and Gaming Roundtable Presidents Program. I am Rebecca Strang. I'm the incoming president-elect of GameRT, and I've served on the GameRT board for the past 2 years. I'm a children's librarian at Naperville Public Library in Illinois, and I'm an avid gamer, and I love to do games programming at my own library. Today, GameRT is very excited to bring you Beth Merkel and Andrew Borman from the Strong National Museum of Play to discuss video game preservation. But before I hand things over to them, I want to let you know that GameRT also has a discussion session about the benefits of gaming happening after this session. And you're also invited to our ALA Play event happening via Zoom tonight at 6 p.m. Central, where you can get together with other library folks for a relaxing evening of games, the announcement of our Game On Grant winner, and some door prizes for fun. And then my final announcement is about our next professional development webinar happening in August, which will feature a panel on games in academic libraries. I'll be putting the link for all of these things into the chat, as well as links for GameRT spaces on Facebook and Discord. And for this program, Beth and Andrew can address questions at the end of their presentation. I will be trying to make note of questions that you guys have during the presentation, but if you can, hold those to the end so that we don't miss any. And then during the presentation, we ask that all attendees please remain muted, but during Q&A, we will be using the Zoom raise hand feature if you prefer to chat on your mic to ask questions instead of type in the chat. So I am thrilled to pass the mic over to Beth and Andrew so we can learn about the amazing things happening with video game preservation at the Strong.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca. So we will get right into it. Our presentation is called Alphie to Zelda, Preserving the History of Video Games at the Strong. Let me see if I can get my screen to go. Okay. So just real quick, a little bit about us. My name is Beth Merkel, and I'm the Director of Libraries and Archives here. I have been with the Strong, I think this is my 7th year. Before this, I was in public libraries. I was public libraries for about 15 years. And just kind of was getting a little bored and saw a job posting that I couldn't say no to, which was, do you want to be the library director of the Library and Archives of Play? So I said, sure. So that's how I ended up making the transition to a special library.
All right, I'm Andrew. I'm the digital games curator. I've been here at the Strong about 3 years. My background is I was a school librarian for about 3 years. I always had an interest in game preservation. I created a website over 15 years ago when I was still in high school. But it turns out there were no jobs in game preservation. So the next best thing was to teach kids how to use information safely, especially online. So at the Strong, I helped make physical exhibits. I help work on all sorts of exhibits you'll hear about in a little bit. But I also do a lot with the preservation of both our physical games that could be decades old, along with digital games that are created today that will probably never get a physical copy other than maybe a few thousand if they're lucky. Do a lot of video, I do a lot of blogs, and follow us both on Twitter. We share a lot of cool stuff.
Okay. So just a rundown of what we'll be going through, and to keep us on task, because we both really love the sound of our own voices and to talk about this stuff. So what we're going to do is to give a well-rounded picture of who we are and the different methods that we use to preserve the history of video games. So we'll start with a brief history of the museum, where we started, where we are now, and where we're headed in the future. We'll talk about our roles and where they fit in at the museum, and the challenges we face in preserving video games and other items. And then we'll talk about some of the different ways that we've come up with to address all these challenges for preservation. And then we will leave time at the end for follow-up questions. So, just to start, a little bit of information about our museum. So this is a quote from our founder, Margaret Woodbury Strong. She was born in 1897, and she was the only child of very wealthy parents. She spent her childhood traveling the world and attending high society events. She split her time between private schools here in Rochester and out in California, also on the coast of Maine. So her parents were both avid collectors. Her father collected books, coins, stamps. Her mother had an interest in Japanese and Asian art. So she inherited this love of collecting from her parents. So she married and had a daughter. So you can see here, there's one of her childhood trips to Japan. The one in the middle is later in life. Both her husband and her daughter preceded her in death, and her daughter didn't have any children, so she basically had no heirs. So in 1968, she secured a charter from the New York State Board of Regents for what she called a Museum of Fascination. And at this point in her life, she had an entire mansion outside of Rochester filled with her objects, about 500,000 things, including 30,000 doll houses and 30,000 dolls and 500 doll houses. So she secured the charter, and then the next year in 1969, she passed away. And at the time, she was the largest single stockholder in Eastman Kodak, which in 1969 was a pretty big deal. So the museum corporation that she had created sort of looked at her collections. They hired experts from Winter Tour, Smithsonian, and they were like, yeah, she's got a lot of dolls and stuff, but that's not really what you make a museum out of, right? It's not academic, it's not scholarly enough. So the Margaret Woodbury Strong Museum opened in 1982, and the focus was on everyday American life from 1820 to 1940, specifically the consequences of progress, the rise of the middle class, and expressions of identity during the age of industrialization. Super exciting. So by the mid 90s, we started offering more programs for families, and that increased the attendance. So 1997, we had a partnership with Sesame Workshop. So we opened the exhibit, How Do You Get to Sesame Street, which is still one of our popular exhibits today. It was really interactive, and building on that, we acquired the Toy Hall of Fame in 2002. And then in 2003, we officially switched our mission to focus on play and artifacts of play, dolls, toys, games. From 2004 to 2006, we went through an expansion, and we added more exhibits, Reading Adventureland and a butterfly garden. And that's when we officially became the Strong National Museum of Play. In 2009, we opened the International Center for the History of Electronic Games, which we abbreviate to ICHEG, and that's the division that Andrew works with. So today, our mission is to explore play and the ways in which it encourages learning, creativity, and discovery, and illuminates cultural history. And right now, we before the pandemic, and we're building back up to it, but we get about 500,000 visitors every year.
Yeah, so to give an idea of the size of the museum, this is one of the real benefits to being in Rochester is there's land. So right now, the museum is 285,000 square feet, which is huge, way bigger. I lived in Albany 3.5 hours away for years, never realized how large it was. That said, we actually just broke ground officially on another expansion project this year, adding 90,000 square feet to the museum. So the first phase of that, it was actually separate. It grew out of the fact that there was this sunken highway that kind of split Rochester in two. Well, it turns out that was not a good thing for the economy. It wasn't a good thing for the residents here in the city. So they filled that space in after decades worth of work. That still didn't quite give us enough land to build a new expansion because we needed some place for people to park. So the first thing was we built a parking garage. It's probably the least exciting part of things, but it's one of the nicest looking parking garages you'll ever see. And it will help us raise our attendance from that 500,000 to hopefully 1 million people per year. Later this year, we hope to open a high throws rope course, which is currently in progress. We just blocked off part of where that's going to go. That's going to go above a diner that we have inside of the museum, a full functioning diner. So you're going to see people climbing and riding a zip line, which is really exciting. It comes with a new entrance area to the museum, which is what you're seeing on your screen right now. Most exciting for me is we'll have more storage space. We currently have 2 storage locations, but we need more. So that's really exciting. But a big part of this expansion is centered around video games and what we're calling digital worlds, which is made up of 2 galleries. One is High Score. This is centered around our World Video Game Hall of Fame, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and really looks to places like New York City to elevate video games in a way that you would do any other traditional art, and make even those that aren't interested in video games see why this is so important to many of us. The other is kind of the opposite. While we do a lot of interactive things in High Score, Level Up is centered around interactivity. What is it like to learn about video games through being in a video game? Looking at things like amusement parks, escape rooms, and that sort of thing. All of this should be done by June 2023. So needless to say, we have a lot of work to do. Beth mentioned our International Center for the History of Electronic Games, ICHEG. This is where we're collecting, studying, and interpreting video games. Other electronic games, things like electromechanical games, pinball games, and that sort of thing. And the ways that electronic games are changing how we play, how we learn, and how we connect to each other. This really grew shortly after the museum defined its play mission. They looked at what is the kind of major form of play that's going on at the time, and that was video games. So to call ourselves the Museum of Play without video games, we wouldn't really be able to do that. So right now in the museum, there's over 500,000 objects between those 2 storage spaces. Over 60,000 of those are related to games, everything from the games themselves, the hardware, to things that are more related to video games. Think toys that happen to be based on video games and that sort of thing. This is the most comprehensive, publicly accessible collection of video games in the United States. And this is where we're collecting, building exhibits, we create videos, we do live streams, all this stuff. We're going to talk about that in just a little bit.
Okay, so I am the director of the Brian Sutton-Smith Library and Archives of Play. Brian Sutton-Smith was pretty much like the preeminent scholar who studied play as an academic discipline. So we have his personal papers, his library, and they really form the basis of our collection here. So we're a research repository devoted to the intellectual, social, and cultural history of play. So right now we're at over 225 volumes, which are books, serials, catalogs, published material. We are rapidly approaching over 3,000 linear feet of archives. And our biggest growth is on our digital content. So both born digital and things that we've preserved digitally. We're adding those TVs, and we typically until 2020 ruined our stats. We were averaging about 80 researchers a year. In 2019, that was a very busy year. We had 110 researchers on site. So these are anything from people who are interested in researching a doll, a game, or a toy, to PhD students. The museum offers 3 fellowships a year. 3 rounds of fellowships. So I think we have a total of like 5 different types of fellowships. So you don't have to be in a PhD program. You don't have to be in academia to get a fellowship. And it's one of the only places that you can come and look at the books from the library, the archives. I always get excited when somebody's researching Barbies, because one of the curators will bring a cart of Barbies up and I get to look. Or board games or puzzles. And so you have it's like a 360 study of an object. And then Andrew's just on the hall, and we coordinate with him if people want to play, if they're interested in video games, they want to play. We have the capability of doing that. So just, people always ask, usually my family members are like, I still don't really understand what you do and what would you possibly research there. So just this year we have somebody researching video games from the 1980s with female protagonists. The connection of video game music to early electromechanical game sounds. The political origins of the Unreal Engine, which is a popular game development software. The ways in which life simulation games help shape emergent play and narratives. So it gets, and those are just the video game ones I picked out. So there's more than just video game research happening here. So that's a little bit about us and where we fit into the big picture of the museum. So due to the variety and the quantity of materials we collect, we've had to get really creative in our preservation strategies. So the next couple of slides will help us discuss how we've had to make some decisions and in what we collect and what we preserve and how we preserve them.
So this is based on a white paper that one of my colleagues, JP, wrote, and this is what's going to form the basis for our video game collecting. So jumping right to the center, it should be no surprise that we have the video games and the hardware at the center. These are the things that guests like to see. They're the things that we first associate with video games. It's the video games themselves and how we play it. Researchers, as Beth was mentioning, come here because they want to play on the original. Yes, they could maybe play a newer version on the Nintendo Switch or the Xbox One, but they want to play on the NES. So they come here and they can do that. But in reality, preserving the history of video games really requires more than just the games and the hardware. The games are a key piece to that puzzle, but they're just a piece. In the digital age, we have so many games that can suddenly become inaccessible. Big multi-billion-dollar franchises. I like to use the example of Farmville. Suddenly, if you realized, Flash is inaccessible as of last December. So Farmville on Facebook, the original, is gone. So if we focus only on the games, we're going to miss a lot of video game history. So next, we really like to focus on the producers, the people in the businesses who are actually creating the games. This helps get us behind the scenes, the magic that make games actually happen and end up on websites or on store shelves, the choices that were made, the prototypes that were made, the communications between the individuals, the people at the companies. But let's be a little real, people playing new versions of Farmville today are way different than the people who were playing Farmville when it first came out in around 2009. So even if we have the games and we have the documentation, the behind the scenes stuff, that doesn't really get us everything. So what are we missing? We're missing the player experience. How do we preserve that? Things like written accounts, video recordings, news articles, magazines, and so much more show how people are actually playing. My colleague JP often brings up a game of baseball. We can't preserve a game of baseball perfectly with the grass, the stadium, the ball, the bats, the players, the audience. All of that happens in a moment of time. Instead, we have to look beyond that. And that's where all of these things come into play. But one of the things that makes us most unique here at The Strong is we're not a video game museum. We are a museum of play. So when you come here to do research, you can just look at video games if you like, but we find that more people are looking at how games interact with other forms of play. And that's that last outer ring. How is it that Pong came about? It wasn't just some idea off the tip of a hat. It was based on tennis. It's based on all these older games that have a history of 100 years or hundreds of years. So you can actually come and research all of that here. But when it comes to digitization and preserving these things, how do we prioritize it?
Yeah, so I forget when it was exactly that I was like, if I had a nickel for every time somebody either in the administration or a donor or just somebody asked me, so when are you going to have everything digitized and posted online? So we, as informational professionals know that digital preservation is more than just digitizing and scanning, right? So we were getting that question a lot. And also, we're having a lot of, we see a lot of grant or funding opportunities to, for grants or funding for digitization projects. And so we found ourselves looking at them, but really trying to make like something fit into it, right? It wasn't exactly what we needed. It wasn't going to preserve what we needed to preserve. It wasn't like one of our priorities. So we formed a little working group and really started to talk through like, so what are we going to tell people? What for ourselves, when we're looking at funding opportunities, when we're talking to donors, when we're talking to both collections and funding donors, what are we going to say when they ask, well, then how do you pick what you digitize? So we came up, we love our acronyms. So we came up with RAVE, which stands for rare, at risk, valuable, and engaging. So rare is in one of a kind, not owned by other institutions. All of our archival collections by their very nature exist in this category. But, Andrew was talking about game builds. That also is sort of the ICHEG side of that. At risk is, things that are threatened by deterioration. So this is, in your old, in the old way that you would look at things, this would be like your book that's falling apart. But in reality, this is like people used to make things on like 8-inch floppies that Andrew just held up.
Zip disk.
Or a zip disk, or or they created something with a software that doesn't exist anymore. So, and it's proprietary software, so you couldn't necessarily get it. Magnetic media is quite an issue. Jazz drives, yes, I just saw that. And then the other category, valuable. So if it documents important historical events, social trends, if it's culturally significant. I'm going to talk about our zine collection a little later.
So just to say that that's not necessarily monetarily valuable. It's
right,
more in the cultural sense.
Yes, yeah. Yes, exactly. And engaging. So things that are visually compelling, iconic, they're very recognizable. So this is one of the big things that people like in our collection is we have a lot of cabinet artwork from arcade and pinball games, marketing materials that in how they sort of, there are different stages of development of things that are very recognizable to people. Okay. So, and this just kind of sums up like so 2016 is when we formed that digital preservation working group and started coming up with that RAVE criteria. And this is sort of like a winding road, right? Like we saw that this was becoming a question that we were getting asked more and more. Then we delved into, and I'll talk about this later, but we started doing, looking at things in our collections, like what we called it endangered media, like what could we lose if we don't do something about it now? And then that we broke it into like, so how are we going to store these things? We did a digital asset management plan. And then we finally got a digital asset management system. And then we went into a very extensive digital preservation handbook that really went into great detail about what we're doing.
Which you can find a public version of online.
Yeah, we can. Yeah, so we do have a version online. And then, now and right now and moving forward, we're at the point where we can start integrating all of these sort of structures we've put around our preservation into our long range plan. So it's been a wild ride, but we're making progress for sure. So now this is the fun part. We get to talk about some of our collections and show some couple of pictures. So we, like Andrew said, we're really the world's most comprehensive collection related to play. So I'll talk about our library collections first. This is what comprises a lot of our, 225,000 plus volumes. We have in our collection over 46,000 trade catalogs. These are the catalogs if I was a toy store owner or the buyer for a department store. This is what I would get sent to me from the manufacturer, like from Lego, from Mattel, from Hot Wheels, right? And I would pick things to stock my shelves, and then usually I'm done with my order, I toss it. We had a married couple, Steve and Diane Olin, were in the toy industry, and they kept all of their trade catalogs. So, and then they donated their collection to us. So that formed the basis of it. But so these are things that don't exist anywhere else. We have created records for these things in WorldCat. So a lot of times we're the only institution that has these. So these will show things like, these might be things that if not enough store owners circled, product X, that didn't get produced. So this might be the only evidence that this toy was even, a twinkle in somebody's eye. It also shows how things were marketed. And we also have the picture on the screen is one of the arcade flyers that we have. So we also have an extensive collection of arcade and pinball flyers. Magazines and zines. So we have an enormous collection of electronic gaming magazines from like Nintendo Power, Famitsu, Replay, Playmeter. So as Andrew was mentioning, they really document user experience and play culture. And, you can trace the history of like the console wars and the, video game industry crash. So those are like the published end, right? In 2017, someone named Chris Kohler donated his collection of about 350 fanzines. So if you're in the know, you're called them zines, and this was in the 90s. I'm probably dating myself, but this was what, you would create your own magazine, your own zine on the topic that you're interested in. And then you go to Kinko's and you make a bunch of copies and you send them to your friends. And so they have, Chris Kohler was inspired by Ernie Katz, who was the editor of Electronic Games. And he put out this call for gamers to create their own fanzines and send them to him so he could review them. So that's how Chris Kohler got started with the zines. And this is, the picture on the screen is one of the illustrations, like people would hand draw these things. So, they have reviews and just they don't exist anywhere else because probably somebody's mother threw them out in their house. So, but now we have Chris's. So it's a fairly heavily used collection, and we were very grateful to have it. So corporate newsletters and press kits. Press kits is actually one of the areas that we're collecting heavily in right now. This is where video games would give these to their sales teams, right? That was how you would, go to the Sears and really and push the Sears people to, to stock your video games on their shelves. We have some collections that have like photos of how you're supposed to set up your display at Sears. Some are press kits for games that never made it to market. So we have a press kit for Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, which was supposed to be released in 2002, and I guess then the company closed. But we have the press kit for it, even though the game never made it to market. Corporate newsletters also, these are like the internal corporate publications. And so they would a lot of times have screenshots of gameplay, descriptions of how they work, what their strategic plan and long range goals were. So those could really give a picture of that game, but also in the context of where the industry was at that time. We also have about 2,100 video game strategy guides dating from about 1990 to 2019. So again, this is user experience, this is screenshots, descriptions of the play. Some of them, like this Prince of Persia, it's like a work of art in itself. They're really high quality, almost your collector's piece, right? And again, we have another example of a game that was developed but not released was Half-Life.
Half-Life, yep,
Half-Life.
for the Dreamcast specifically,
okay.
Yep.
Yeah, so that's, might help if I do this. And then on my archives side, so in our archival collections, our collections related to video games I sort of divide them into two categories. You have the corporate records, the video game companies themselves, and then we have collections, papers of individual designers. So on the corporate side, you've got, here's some examples of what we have. Our largest collection is the Atari coin-op division. We've got Bally Midway Williams, which is pinball, Broderbund, Her Interactive, which is the company that does the Nancy Drew games, Sierra Online, and MAC, which is Oregon Trail, right? Some of our individual designers, Carol Shaw, Danny Button-Berry, Jerry Lawson, Jordan Mechner, Ralph Baer, and Will Wright. So these are some examples from the corporate side. So in these collections, you've got game development documentation, focus group reports, cabinet art, and assembly drawings. This was actually when the pandemic started. I feel like a whole population of people decided that this was the time that they were going to recreate this arcade cabinet or pinball. We filled so many, like, it was request after request for, like, I need the cabinet work, I need the schematics, I need all these. So I'm hoping that these people got their machines working. But technical documentation, you've got memos, financial reports, the research material, correspondence, photographs. Like this is, I feel like that's a Sierra, a Mac, corporate photo. In the middle this is from Sierra Online. This is a letter to Sierra Online and Ken and Roberta Williams from Steve Wozniak, saying what a fan he is of their work. Over in the upper corner, there is one of researchers really like to look at the focus group stuff. So this is from Her Interactive. This was, they decided they were going to make video games that appealed to teenage girls, right? So great idea. Let's form a panel of teen girls and have them play the games, and let's find out what they think. So this is the first page of one of the responses for the Secrets Can Kill game evaluation form. In the Atari collection, we have some focus group reports from Asteroids. So let me see what else. I've got a couple other pictures of corporate stuff. No, this is designers. On the designer side, we've got, more game design documentation, notes and sketches, source code printouts. We're getting a lot of those. And just the ephemera that's related to, your career as a game designer. So the one in the middle, that's River Raid. This is the source code from Carol Shaw. So she started working for Atari, and in 1978, they asked her to make a game for some kind of weird advertising partnership with Ralph Lauren. So she made this game called Polo, and it wasn't released at the time, but then it was released later. But this was, olden days. So they would have to draw their graphics on graph paper, hand code it. And Carol Shaw would handwrite her code on paper and then type it in, because there was no programs to do this. So there's, it really captures what it was like to design games at the time. Over on the right there is Jerry Lawson. So he worked for Fairchild in the 1970s, and his management asked him to create a video game console prototype. This is technical stuff I don't necessarily understand, but he utilized the Fairchild F8 processor as in the base console and developed a mechanism which allowed for the insertion of separate memory devices, game cartridges, without destroying the console's semiconductors. So this is essentially the first home video game system that you could put different cartridges in for each game. So it was called the Channel F, and it's pretty cool. Then let's see next. So here's some more pieces from designer collections. The upper right, that's from some of Will Wright's game design notebooks. So Will Wright did SimCity, Sims, and Spore. So his notebooks you can really go through, and this is where he's figuring out, all the different categories of activities that your Sims can do. There's a lot of interesting notes about, going to like using the facilities and all kinds of stuff. So it's quite interesting. Last visually pleasing is the schematic over there. That's from Ralph Baer papers. So he invented Simon, but he has a lot of technical stuff, schematics in his collection. And those photos at the bottom, that's from Jordan Mechner. So he used what's called rotoscoping. So he had his brother do these action moves, and he would film it, but then he would print out each frame of the film, and then he would color it in, and then he'd like re-put it together. So it's, yeah, okay. So Prince of Persia. Yeah, so he did Prince of Persia. It's a really cool, visually really neat collection to look at as well.
So I know I'm watching the clock, but there's so many more things to share with you. It's overwhelming sometimes to be here. Our Japanese video game collection, these are over 8,000 games from Japan, specifically Japanese region games. Everything from the Famicom, Nintendo Famicom, which is the NES here, the Famicom disk system, all the way through their GameCube games. Sega systems going back to the Mark III through the Dreamcast, including the Saturn. PC Engine games, so much more. It's in there, all boxed and complete. It's such an accessible collection that we actually have researchers from Japan who come here to use our games because it's easier than trying to track them down around Japan. Now with prototypes, a lot of these end up in the archives, including the one in the upper left, which I wanted to mention is based on the book Amun is a Harsh Mistress. This game never came out. This is made by Interplay shortly, I believe, after they were making Wasteland, which still gets sequels today from Brian Fargo papers, and they would go on to make games like Fallout. So really great stuff to see that. Maze Invaders is from our Atari collection, but is one of 2 cabinets known to exist in the world. Completely playable game, never came out. On the right-hand side, we have a Microsoft console. It's the Xbox 360, specifically the slim version, but this was a manufacturing sample where they're still getting all the pieces figured out. Very, very incomplete, but runs unique software on there. I think we can move on to the next one.
Okay.
We also have collections of retail games. Now, if you know anything about floppy disk, it's very, very easy to either fail at this point or they write content back to them. But because these are the actual games that they would have in their company archives, they often weren't played. So these are brand new. These are things that we could go to, and we're currently building our processes up and back up and have pristine copies as if you had gone and picked them up off the shelf back in the 80s or 90s. On the right, though, really shows how our collections are more than just the video games themselves. Paul Sams was the COO of a little company named Blizzard. They made World of Warcraft, Diablo, many other huge, gigantic games. And yes, he donated so many retail copies of games from all different regions, all different languages, which are awesome. But he also donated things like merchandise, action figures, things like these dog tags, things that show that it's not just about the games, that it goes beyond the games. And those are collections that are really going to show that games really were a major form of play, that they expanded on other forms of play and weren't just the games themselves. But let's talk about some preservation projects.
We're just, so we'll go right into it. Andrew's up with his preserving gameplay.
So the reality of video games is that the hardware and the software isn't going to last forever. We're going to do our best. We have an arcade technician that focuses on preserving our over 300 arcade and pinball machines. But what happens when they fail? Yes, there is emulation. I saw some questions we'll talk about in chat in a little while. But with video game capture, this was a project that was born out of wanting to capture original footage of the original games running on the original hardware while those things were still accessible. So we had interns coming in over a multi-year period to where they recorded footage for hundreds of games in our collection, which are a very valuable research tool for the researchers coming here, because not everybody wants to play the games, they just want to see them. They're useful in exhibits development. They're useful for things like documentaries. We've worked with many documentary groups and provided footage. On the right is a bit of a stream/YouTube series that I do called Game Saves, where because we don't have the copyright of these things, we can't just put them on the Internet Archive or that sort of thing. But what we can do is we can share parts of that. So some of that is sharing gameplay, taking behind the scenes into the archive, into the collection, and sharing things. That is the earliest known version of a little game called Age of Empires, when it was still called Dawn of Man. Only known copy existing in the world. You can find interviews of the developers talking about it. They almost never show footage, but you can find that one on YouTube.
So yeah, we mentioned this earlier. So we call this our endangered media project. So we did that survey, starting with the archival collections, sort of going through them, being like, you got your big desk, like, what formats do we have? What are the ages of these formats? Like, which ones are at most risk? So the first on our list was our floppy disks. Now, the 8-inch floppy disks, like, fortunately, the ones that we had in our collection, somebody had already gotten the data off of them, because you cannot find an 8-inch floppy reader at this point. But there is something called a cryoflux, which lets you image the data that is on 3.5 inch and 5.25 inch floppies. So we started the initial project, we got a grant for it, and we wanted to do like 100 of our discs, thinking like, 50% are going to fail, because these are, 1980. So, but turns out we at least got an image off of all of them. So then we just kept going, and we did every floppy disk in our archival collections we did. So right below the eyeball on the disk is one of the things that we pulled off of one of the floppies. This is Dimensions. It's the physical arcade cabinet for Marble Madness 2, Marble Man, an Atari game, arcade game that was canceled before it hit the market. So we, find these things, and we found a bunch of stuff from about GEM and the holograms that I didn't include in this, but some good stuff. After the floppies, next on the list was U-matic tapes. So these are, this is a crazy tape, the tape comes out of the cassette and grows through a machine. So like, if I'm going to invent a cassette, like, how about I have it with as many fail points as possible in the machine? So apparently that was the idea with U-matic. So we got the equipment and started looking at some of our U-matic tapes. So we got, I think we did almost 2,000 minutes of film. Again, one of the ones from, let's see, there was one that had stuff about Mortal Kombat, and from concept art to the sound design, original recordings of actors, like all of this stuff was on one of the U-matic tapes. So it's like, it's like Christmas, you never know what you're going to get. And then the last format I'll let Andrew talk about.
Yeah, so there's a lot of CDRs in the archival collection, which isn't too surprising, but like I mentioned, there is some of that bleed over where they end up in our general collection, usually because they didn't come in with an archival collection, or they're older and represent some of the beginning foundations of our video game collection. The problem is CDRs don't last as long as commercial CDs. Now, commercial CDs are failing, but CDRs are failing because they're writable at a much higher rate. And you really don't know, are these different things? Are they pre-release things? Are they unreleased games? Or are they just a pirated version that somebody made on their own desktop? Getting into them more as we start to back them up, we're starting to find some really unique things. So even in cases where studios have backed up their source code properly, we're still finding things that they didn't have. In the case of System Shock, the source code to that game is out there on the internet. You can go find it, you can compile it, but what they didn't have was the map editor. I found a pre-release build of the game that had the map editor that they used to make all the different rooms inside the game. Things that, this game was marked as System Shock Burn CD. Not the most useful in our catalog, But once you understand what you're looking at, there are some really, truly magical things in here that we need to back up now before the CDs degrade anymore. So our research and conservation and preservation lab is currently made up of essentially one room that's connected to our collection storage space. The library has their own digital preservation hub, which is awesome. They're really doing a great job of building that out. But our arcade game conservation lab and our access and research center are really one area currently. So while this is convenient, it does have security risks. But the biggest problem is we outgrew that space many, many months or years ago. So our goal right now is, this is something that we're working on currently, is we're building a new research and preservation lab thanks to a grant from the Killian Schmidt Foundation. This lab will include new PC hardware that allows for things like video capture and editing, along with game preservation. I briefly held up when Beth was talking about the Channel F, a cartridge reader for Channel F games. This will allow us to back up games without hurting them. That's one of the things going into the new lab. But it also will include all the most commonly requested pieces of video game hardware, all set up and ready to go just by hitting a switch or two. These won't be collections objects because we take care of video games the same way you would a classic painting. We have conservation logs, we have conservation techniques. And how much can you change in a video game console until it's not what you said it was in the first place? So we're going to set aside the collection we already have and build a new collection that is strictly meant for use. Many of these things are going to be modified, whether that's basic new capacitors that will keep it going, hopefully another decade or two, or replacing failing parts that you can't get anymore, like CD-ROM drives, with something a bit more new, like an SD card reader or that sort of thing. Combined with things like cartridge readers and CD backup devices, we can actually take these games and no longer use the original media, preserving those and keeping those pristine. I mentioned those floppy disks earlier. We don't have to use that original floppy disk because we can back it up, we can put it in some sort of emulator, and we can play a copy, meaning that every time a researcher or a guest comes to the museum, they're playing the game just like it was meant to be played, not in the 1980s or 90s. A very popular example I'll give real quick is if you go to the Internet Archive and play Oregon Trail, the first thing you'll see after you create your character is a big tombstone that says, Andy has died, pepperoni and cheese. Doesn't really make sense, but that is something that somebody inserted into that game, and that's one of the most popular copies of the game on the internet today. But we'll have a pristine copy that researchers can come and play that sadly don't mention pepperoni and cheese.
All right, we're gonna blast through the last couple of things, and then we can get to the questions. So these are just some of the innovative ways that we've decided to preserve video games and their history. So we have our Women in Games initiative that started in 2017, and it sort of has three parts to it. We have Fabulous Women in Games exhibit that is, you can view it in the museum right now. We have our collecting from women in the video game industry, their papers to be held in the archives. And we also have annual programming. So the first 2 years, 2018 and 19, were in person, but a panel discussion. And it was online in 2020. I don't know what it's going to be in 2021, but we have recordings of those. We also took oral histories, interviews with each of the women, and transcripts of those. So we're really trying to capture what it was like for them in the industry.
Indie games. We think about video games as being this multi-million-dollar production. Well, it turns out there's a lot of people in their bedrooms, garages, and otherwise making these things either as a hobby project or at the smallest of budgets. These are games that really represent a huge population of people who are making it, a diverse population. And they're things that are underpreserved, often because they're digital only and sometimes only available for a small period of time. So we're focusing on indie games the same way we do those big productions, getting the behind the scenes information, getting the games, and hearing from the people that are making them. With our World Video Game Hall of Fame, this was founded in 2015. This is not about the best games ever, because everybody has their own opinion. But we have criteria to select these games that range from icon status. Is it widely recognized? Longevity. Is it more than just a passing fad? Geographical reach. We are the World Video Game Hall of Fame. We want these to be worldwide reach games. And influence. Has this game influenced other games? Has it influenced other popular culture? So you have games like Sonic the Hedgehog, which celebrated its 30th anniversary just a couple of days ago, Super Mario Brothers, and Pac-Man, but they're joined by games like Colossal Cave Adventure, Space War, even Solitaire, which they're not really the things you think of when you think about video games, but they're all important in their own way. And this helps us collect around some of these most important games too, because our collection really is the center of a lot of what we do here. Lastly, for me, is we had a book that we put out in 2018 called A History of Video Games in 64 Objects. It does exactly what the title implies. Everything from Oregon Trail and its impact on education, the Atari 2600, and a server blade from World of Warcraft represent a very broad history of games. So I highly recommend checking it out, and let me know on Twitter, what was it that you would choose as the 65th object? We also work with various partners on actual video games. In partnership with RIT and Second Avenue Learning, a local game studio, we created an app for phones and Nintendo Switch called the Original Mobile Games. This game recreates old puzzle games in the museum's collection, sometimes more than 100 years old, often like ball rolling puzzles like you see here, Pigs in Clover. And we give some background information about the game, and we let you play them. Knowing that they're sometimes over 100 years old, we can't let people handle them all that often, but you can pick up your phone and play anytime you like. And we partner with other people, including Chris Kohler, who is now at Digital Eclipse out in California, as they work on all sorts of fun projects, including the Blizzard Arcade Collection, which just came out recently, which features scans of certain boxes in our collection that help tell a broader story, including some of those from Paul Sam's Blizzard Collection.
And just the last thing sort of builds on the oral history concept. We started during the pandemic, we started alternative programs. So one of the things we started was cocktails with the creators. So this is the one that we just had with Nolan Bushnell, co-founder of Atari and Chuck E. Cheese, and asking him about his experience in the game industry. We have one coming up in August that is Jill Barad from, she was CEO of Mattel, and she created She-Ra, Princess of Power. We had one with Bonnie Erickson and her husband. Bonnie Erickson created Miss Piggy for Jim Henson. We had one with the founders of Shindana, which was a company that made dolls for the African American community. And all of these are available on YouTube as well. Just another way to capture the history from people who have been there. So we only 3 minutes over. So now we can go to questions.
I've been taking notes, watching some of them. So
I have not.
That was fantastic, you guys. So much information, and I think you've got a lot of new fans in our audience who would love to visit you guys. So from the questions that I was tallying up, there were a few people who were wondering about donation efforts. How do you accept donations? What are the guidelines for donations? And how can people find out if they have something that you would accept?
I recommend looking at our online collections pages, both for our general collection, which is the objects, and the library collection. There is a link on our museumofplay.org website that allows you to reach out to us. We like to cross-reference things. We don't really like unsolicited donations at this point because we have so much. And unfortunately, our new online collections page is still catching up to some of our more recent donations. So only about 1/5 to 1/4 of it is actually online right now. So reach out to us. We're happy to cross-reference it. It counts as a donation for tax purposes, which is always popular.
Yeah, I just popped in, and my computer's fighting me. I popped in a link to our page that has for the different categories, who you contact for what. So for instance, I would look at books, Andrea would look at video games, and there's also some FAQ And I will also pop in, Andrew mentioned our different catalogs. I will put those in as well, just so people can have links to that. I pulled them up in another window, so I will do that now.
Awesome, thank you. And then we also had a question from someone who was wondering about how you tackle current video games who have more of a live service where they're constantly updated.
Sure.
And how you go about preserving games like that.
So obviously we can't preserve everything. That's the first thing that we need to accept. Unfortunately, things will get lost. But I do try to personally identify as much as I can. Games like Fall Guys or Among Us, which were so huge over the past year or so, I try to back up some of the data anyway for those games. I recognize that they're not going to be immediately useful because you can't go and play them, but that's still something that we try to do when we have time and when we have space that allows that. Digital space is at a premium, as people may know. The other part is things like magazines that Beth helps bring in, video game footage, recording footage. I've personally, if I sit down and play something new, like when Mario Kart Tour came out on the phone, I recorded footage because that could be the best representation of what a game was like. We also reach out to different communities. We've worked with the speedrunning community in the past, and that's something we'd really like to see more of going forward is, you know, there's people out there that have made a living playing games. We would love to be able to store some of that here and make that accessible to researchers, to documentarians, and others that would like to use the footage.
Awesome. Next question that I had here was someone was asking about what role do Microsoft's backwards compatibility initiatives play in your preservation work?
Sure. So I absolutely love the things that Microsoft is doing. Microsoft has been kind enough to donate to us as well in terms of objects in the collection, but they're doing great work in keeping things accessible to people. And that's kind of one of the most popular things that comes up in game preservation is I want to play the game. So Microsoft is doing a really great job of doing that. And I personally believe, and I would say that a lot of my colleagues would agree, but I won't put words into their mouth, that the best preservation occurs within a company. So when a company cares about their past, when they care about making these things accessible, that makes our job easier. That makes everybody's job easier, especially when we start talking to them about preservation. We don't have to say, why is game preservation important? They already know, they're already investing in it without necessarily having to do that. So backwards compatibility, I see as being a tool, just like emulation in general is a tool, but it doesn't replace the original experience as well. So that may be great for 99% of cases, but with backwards compatibility, you see things like higher frame rates, higher resolution, sometimes fixing some bugs that weren't there in the first place. It's not necessarily the most authentic experience, but if you want to play, the fact that you can log on right now and have the game in about 10 minutes, it's pretty hard to beat.
Someone also wants to know if the Strong has an Animal Crossing island.
We do not. I would say there are probably a few of us that have our own islands at various states of disarray at this point of the pandemic. But we did induct Animal Crossing into our World Video Game Hall of Fame this year. And my wife was so kind as to let me use her island, which she's kept a lot better than mine is right now. I did have to cut around. She was not a big fan of Tom Nook, and there was a suspicious chalk outline outside one of his houses. So,
yeah, my own island is probably just filled with weeds right now because it's been a while since I've played. Another question that came up is what kind of standards or metadata formats do you use in your catalogs? And do you find that mark-based ILS impedes discoverability or challenges you in some way?
So I dumped the 3 links into the chat. So because we have, just to the consternation of our finance and IT department, we firmly stand by the belief that the museum object database and cannot work for the archives or the library collection. The library catalog doesn't work for archival collections or the museum objects, and our archives catalog doesn't work for the other 2. So when people are want to look at our resources, we send them a link to each of the catalogs. So for archival collections, we are using ArchiveSpace, And we use DAX and also have subject headings. A lot of times we, on the library side, we will create a subject heading and we use that in archive space as well, just to have continuity. But on the library side, we use MARC. But a lot of times, so like with our trade catalogs, if Elsie, the subject heading would be like catalog toys. If you search on that, like that doesn't mean anything. Like that's not what people are here for. So we created a lot of local subject headings that like a couple of pages of them that were what we use in-house, so that we in our online catalog, so that we can find things, so that we can find the things that has sand toys, or the thing that has bricks, the Lego stuff. So like we needed to specialize our subject headings. And our museum catalog is argus.net, and you use some kind of
it's some weird hybrid thing that needs to work from everything from the tiniest doll shoe up until the diner that I talked about earlier. That used to be the largest object in the collection, was the diner, but now I think it's down to being a carousel. For repair and conservation reasons, the diner is no longer a object. So it needs to work from everything from little to gigantic. It's not perfect for any of them, but at the end of the day, we can make it work. You can find stuff, and we do our best.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. This was a fantastic presentation. We learned a whole lot about what you guys do, and I am dying to get up there to visit at some point.
Yeah.
So for the folks in the audience, hopefully some of you can join us for ALA Play tonight and get some gaming on. And then don't forget, we have a discussion session coming up at 3:30 that you can find in the convention program list. And thank you from GameRT for joining us today, and we'll hope to see you at some future events. Thanks again, Beth and Andrew.
Thank you.
I'll try to join the Discord chat if anybody wants to.
I don't know what Discord is. So. I'm going to go do something old.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.